So a lot of times advisors, when they go for a sales appointment, they lose the sale and they think it's a lot to do with objection handling. They maybe lack the right product knowledge, or sometimes they might think that they had a maybe bad quality lead, for example, or perhaps even attributing it to the very fact that maybe they didn't know the profile of the customer, right? Whether it's their anagram or their DISC profile, so on and so forth, right? Now, after coaching more than 300 plus advisors and generating more than 25 million in sales for them, I can tell you that those are not true. Right now, the real reason why you lose the sale is because of you're missing one of these 7 elements, right? That's required in any sales appointment that put the prospect into buying state to say yes. Okay, and so in this video, I'm going to break down these 7 essential sales elements. They must include the appointment so you can close more deals. And I'm going to walk through each of these 7 elements, right? What they are, why it matters, and how to apply them. So that once you know how to do that and you apply everything, your closing ratio will go up, you stop getting ghosted, and you start to feel that at least your sales appointments is more systematic, it's more structured, so that every time you go for appointments, it's predictable and it can make it reliable and consistent as well. Okay, and so now again, if you don't know who I am, basically my name is Benjamin Ong. I'm founder of Authentic Advice Systems, and we help advisors grow their sales through proven systems so they never have to guess what to do next. Okay, and so the reason why I'm doing these videos is because most advisors are stuck, not because they're lazy, but because they don't have a clear step-by-step system or process to get to where they want to go, and I don't want you to be one of them. Okay, so now let's dive into this 7 sales elements, right? Juicy stuff today. I can tell you, let me just say that, with these 7 elements, every time I do a case study or with our clients, or perhaps doing even a role play and everything else, these are the 7 elements that we use as frameworks, right? That identify, that allows you to identify and understand where did your sales appointment went wrong, right? Because the last thing you want is that even though you lose the sale or you didn't close, you don't know exactly what went wrong, and that's the worst. Because if you don't know exactly what went wrong, then the question becomes, how are you going to improve, right? Because you can't improve without knowing what exactly went wrong. Okay, and so these are 7 elements, right? So the 7 elements are R, A, F, P, P, D, S. Okay, I'm gonna just put it here and then I'll explain it, right? So let's talk about R. So R stands for rapport. Okay, rapport. So now a lot of times the thing here is that, when it comes to rapport, it seems like a very common thing, right? And I can tell you so many times that when I ask someone what's the objective of rapport, people don't understand, right? People tend to say rapport is about trust building. And my answer to that is that if rapport is just about trust building, then usually rapport is about maybe a few minutes, 5 minutes maybe, or 10 minutes max, right? How much trust are you going to build within 10 minutes, right? And so it helps with the trust building, but it's not about trust building, right? And so the objective of rapport, right? This is where you kind of talk a little bit, have some weather talk, so on and so forth, right? The objective of rapport is about placing someone in a good state, right? Placing someone in a good state. That's literally the objective of building rapport, right? Place someone in a good state. So let me explain that a bit, right? So a lot of times, if you think about it, before these prospects meet you, what tends to happen is that they probably came from some other event, and the event could be, they came from work, they were in a rush, maybe they just had their coffee, so on and so forth, right? And so the problem here is that sometimes if you do not know what state the prospect is in, what tends to happen is that if the prospect is a bad state, no matter what you're going to say later on, even if your script and presentation is 100% clear cut and it's perfect, it's not going to be that effective, right? And so if you really put in real life, for example, if let's say you're meeting a prospect, and let's say you meet this prospect, and perhaps 5 minutes ago, this prospect literally just had a huge quarrel and argument with his wife, for example, right? Like a huge ass argument, like one of those crazy fights, right? And they had a huge ass argument, and then 5 minutes later, he's meeting you for your policy review or maybe your opening appointment. Now the question here becomes this, right? Do you think he or she is going to be in a very good state to listen to what you have to say? Probably not, right? Probably not. And it's very hard for people to just switch off the emotions and say, okay, you know what, I'm fine, I'm open to do a policy review right now, even though I just had a huge argument with my partner. It's probably going to be hard, right? And so this is the reason why you have to put someone in a good state, right? The whole point of rapport is put someone in a good state, because once you do that, then at least you might not put them into exactly like a very happy good state per se, but at least you want to neutralize the state so that they are at least being more receptive kind of like bandwidth and mind space, right, to really listen to you. Okay, and this is one of the most important thing, because the moment you screw this up, and especially sometimes it might not even be a quarrel, right? Like sometimes prospects could be in a rush. Maybe they were late after they finished work and they're rushing to meet you, and in that state of like the rush and everything else, they are kind of like a bit flustered, they and they might not be in a good state to really listen to what you have to say, right? They might just want to kind of like get it over and done with, if that makes sense, right? And so that's not going to be good for you, because if someone just wants to get it over and done with, then they're not going to really take your words and consider and internalize your questions and words that seriously as well, which ultimately affects the sale, right? And so that's basically number one, right? Is to build rapport, and rapport is to put someone in a good state. Okay, so most important element, but simple and everything else, right? So make sure that you put someone in a good state, and that's what rapport is all about. Now let's talk about number two. Now, A stands for agenda. Okay, agenda. Now this is like simple stuff, right? Like it seems no-brainer, but I mean, even you go to school, or maybe you meet someone, generally speaking, there's always an agenda, right? The thing is this, right? Every time you meet someone, okay, so let's say that's you, and then you have a meeting, okay, meeting with the other person. The thing here is that there's always an agenda. Now, the agenda could be implied or it could be explicit, right? But if you think about, let's say you catch up with your friend, okay, when you catch up with your friend, there's actually an agenda, right? The agenda is to what? The agenda is to know more about each other, right? And perhaps the other secondary agenda is to perhaps build a relationship more, feel, want to listen in ear, so on and so forth, right? And so there's always a implied agenda, okay? And so when you go to an appointment, one of the key things is that as when you're doing sales, right, as an advisor, is that you want to set the agenda right. And the reason for that is very simple. So agenda itself, you want to look at it as a form of pre-framing, right? Future pacing, and it's kind of like demonstrating kind of authority, right? So you want to have agenda because you want to also demonstrate clear outcomes, right, that you're going to achieve with this prospect during the session. Because if you don't do this, what tends to happen is that your prospect will either be likely very confused with what you're planning to do, or when they're achieving our session, right? So please do not omit this simple step. And so the worst thing is this, right? I don't know if you have been through this, but I've been through so many case studies with advisors and our clients for the last few years, right? Is that when they don't set an agenda, what tends to happen here is one of two things. Number one is, they start presenting. They start, oh, hi, blah, blah, blah. Then they, straight away ask some questions, or they start presenting a concept, for example. And what tends to happen is that the prospect halfway through might say things like, hey, I've seen this before, skip it, just go straight to the point, right? Or like they might end up, being a little bit annoyed, and they might ask you back, why are you doing this presentation? Or like, why are you asking so many questions? How about you just tell me X, Y, Z? And so and the reason for that happening is because like there wasn't any agenda set, and so they don't understand what you're gonna do, or even like they don't understand why you're doing what they do. Make sense, right? Because maybe, for example, this is very common. Let's say in the cold market, right? So let's say when you do cold market, perhaps let's say you give away a freebie, right? And the prospect meet you because he wants the free portable battery charger or whatever. And what happens here is that like their agenda is that I want the portable battery. And then your agenda, on the other hand, is not only to give the battery, right? Your agenda is also to present a lot of stuff, present your concepts and so forth, and try to make a sale. And so you realize there's already conflicting agendas. And so if you don't set out right, straight, transparently what the agenda is and why you're going to do what they do, then what will happen is that, they're going to think that it's a waste of time, okay? And so that's really like the important thing, and this is the reason why you want to set agenda. Because if you don't set, I think it's just very simple. If you don't set an agenda, the other party, which is your prospect/client, will set an agenda for you. And that's not really a good thing, because all great salespeople have to be the one leading a conversation, not the other way around. Okay? And so there's a very simple way of setting an agenda. And there are really three parts here, right? So number one is you want to explain what is going to happen in this session, right? What is going to happen in this session. Then you want to talk about number two, what is going to happen at the end, like what's the outcome, right? So there's like what's the outcome at the end of this session. And then number three, then what's going to happen in the next session, right? And so the way I look at this is that your next session is kind of like a future pace. This is giving them the objective, and then this is telling them like what and why you're doing it, right? And so typically speaking, it will sound something like, hey, first of all, hey, good to see you, blah, blah, blah. There'll be 3 things we're going to do here today, Mr. Prospect. Number one, I'm going to share with you a short overview of myself, and the clients, they usually work with so that they have a better idea of what I do, why I do the things I do, right? And then number two, I would be diving deeper into, let's say, the questions as well, to really allow you to understand like what are the different products or solutions out there, why we need it to begin with, and more importantly, whether are these the things that could be something that you're missing or need. Okay, and then lastly, once I run through everything, let's look at what are things that you're missing, and if everything works out well, and if you think that we are a good fit, then what's going to happen is that in the next session we're going to talk about more in detail in terms of like solutions. Okay, but if not, we can like have a good conversation and see what we can do for you, right? And so you depends on how you want to frame it, but generally speaking, you can just talk about like, okay, what you're going to do here and why you're going to do it. You talk about what's going to happen at the end of the session, and then you just need to talk about like, okay, what's going to happen next in the next session. Okay, so that's kind of like simple stuff, but super important as well. And so one of the things is that a lot of times during your opening appointment, and agenda obviously can be done for closing appointments as well, but during your opening appointment, you also like, it's usually 2 things that will happen, right? Number one is you're going to ask them questions, which is fact find, and then number 2 is that you're going to do a concept presentation. Like usually it's one of 2 things, if not both. And so you want to tell them what you're going to do and then why you're going to do it. Because if you don't tell people why you do what you do, people will always assume the worst of you. Okay? And so that's basically that for agenda. And super duper important, especially in cold prospects, okay, and cold market. Okay, so that's basically for agenda. Okay, no, so we are good. We are 2 things down, and then let's talk about basically the third one, right? The third one is called, third element is fact find. Okay, now here's the interesting thing. A lot of times, again, I ask a lot of advisors, and as coaching them, I ask them, okay, what is the definition of fact find, or what's the objective of fact find? And a lot of times when people talk about fact find, they think it's just about asking questions, to understand. It's like there's 2 parts, right? Like first is I want to ask questions, and the objective of that is to understand. Okay, understand. Now, while this is not wrong, the challenge here is that if you do not know exactly what are you understanding or what's the objective of the fact find, then you're going to ask a bunch of random questions, which does not help you to move forward the sale. And while you could understand them a lot better, it's not going to get them to want to move forward at the end of the day with you as well, right? And it might even be a waste of time. And so the goal about fact find is very simple. I want you to think of fact find. So asking questions is correct. Like just to be clear, like fact finding, asking questions is absolutely correct. Understanding is also kind of correct, but you want to know what are you exactly trying to understand. And so there are only 2 things you're trying to understand, or rather 2 types of questions you want to ask, generally speaking, in the fact finding process. So you need to understand that at the end of the day, sales is basically finding out where their current situation are, where's their future, right? And so if I draw this, let's say this rectangle over here, right? And you want to find out basically, okay, you know what? Let me just like put here. So there's a current, and then there's future, right? Future is kind of their goals, how much money they want, what kind of house they want to stay, so on and so forth. And then their current situation is how much they're earning, how much they're saving, are they saving enough, yada yada. Okay, now the thing here is this: when every prospect have a future and have a current state, and the gap in between, this hideous gap that I'm drawing over here, this gap here, right, in between is essentially the gap, which is also known as the problem, right? And if you think about like the definition of sales, which I did in one of my previous videos, is that the definition of sales, or the whole objective of sales, right, is that you are solving a problem with an appropriate solution in exchange for money. That's basically about it, right? So a sale can only happen if, first of all, there's a problem and you can offer a solution, and then they take your solution and give you money in exchange. That's basically what sale is all about. And so before a sale can happen, you need to first understand what is the problem. And in order to understand what is the problem, you need to first ask them where's their future state, where's their current state, and then like the problem, right? And so for example, if let's say you talk to a prospect, right? And then you say like, okay, so Mr. Prospect, one of your goals is to retire by 47 years old with 1.5 million in the bank. Okay, gotcha. How much do you have right now, right? And then he's saying like, oh, I only have 30K and I'm only saving $150 and I'm 37 years old. Then it's kind of a far gap, right? Like it's kind of far gap. It's kind of hard to reach another 1/million in 10 years, especially if it's not really saving much or even a high earner to begin with. And so you start to realize that there is a problem to begin with, right? And it could be a potential problem that you can solve. Okay, and so basically all your questions you want to ask is you want to ask what's the future and what's basically the current situation. Okay, you don't want to, so the goal is like again to find out about the gaps. And so all the fact finding questions should allow you to find out the problems or the gaps in between. If you start asking questions about how many dogs he or she has and how old is the dog, is the dog active, does the dog shit at home or like needs to shit outside, like those things, even though you get the answers, you might understand the person and the dog better, but does it lead to the problem that you can solve? Might not, right? So it depends on like the context, but most of the time it's probably a little bit hard, right? And so then you start to realize that these questions might not be the most relevant per se. Okay, and so remember, the goal of fact finding is to find out the problem and find out the gap. If your questions don't lead you to finding out their future and their current and therefore the problem, then you're probably asking the wrong questions. Okay, and that's the last thing you want, right? Because like everybody thinks that, oh, if you ask more questions, you understand the prospect better, the prospect will like you more, yada, feel appreciated. No, like the prospect just thinks it's a waste of time. Okay, now of course, if you're doing a catch-up appointment, that is a different thing, right? But if let's say we're assuming it's an opening appointment, then you want to make sure that fact finding leads to the problem. Okay, so now, so we cleared three things. Okay, so we've done rapport, we've done general fact finding. Now the third or the fourth element is, as you can guess it's basically problem. Okay, and I'll cover the next one together as well, the fifth element, which is also known as pain. So the thing about like problem is that once you find out like where they want to go and where they are right now, and you obviously identify a problem, right? The next thing here is that you want them to realize the problem. Okay, so think about this way. Remember like my triangle here, right? So there is the current state and then you have the future state, and you really identify like the gap, right? So you know the problem, like you understand the problem. The challenge here is that just because you understand and you can identify the problem does not necessarily mean that the prospect can identify it or at least realize that they have a problem. Okay, and so the thing here is that now the goal under P, right, is you want to make them realize. You want to make them realize that they have a problem. Okay, and I want to make a key differentiation here, which is like there's a difference between realize, and knowing. There is a difference between realize and knowing. And so knowing, in knowing, it's a little bit more like a intellectual understanding, right? It's more like let's say you know the problem. And this is a very common mistake that a lot of advisors make, which is like you identify a problem, you know this person don't have a hospital plan, it's not investing, it's putting money in the bank, yada, and you know it's going to be a problem because he might not be able to retire. What tends to happen here is that because we know a problem and we want the other prospect to know the problem, we literally just tell them. We say that, hey, Mr. Prospect, you're 30 years old right now, you're going to retire in 10 years' time. Obviously, you're not having enough money, so you can't get there, and this is a problem, right? And then you just kind of tell them, and that's usually not the most effective way to get about it, right? Because your prospect can know the problem, but they might not realize or admit they really have a problem, right? And so the key thing about like you want to do is to make it realize. So I put it in Chinese, or like this is saying, right? It's easier to, at least for me, to express that. So when someone knows something, they will say things like, okay, in knowing in Chinese, right? It's like 知道, right? They know, they 知道. So they understand it logically. Now the thing is that when it comes to realization is about 发现到, right? 发现到. And so what's the difference between 知道 and 发现到? Very simple. 发现到 has an emotional realization to it. There's an emotional internalization, right? And so if you think about like, oh, I just realized, and then when you say those statements like, I realized that something, you feel like there's something that is more impactful. That makes sense, right? There's more impactful. There's kind of like this aha moment, so to speak, right? And so you think back to, when maybe you're in school and then you discover something, right? Or a lecturer explains something and then you're like, oh my God, finally, like, right, this is totally the answer. So it's kind of like a realization, right? It's kind of like a light bulb moment. And that's what you want your prospect to feel, right? You want them to realize they have a problem. You want them to feel like, shit, right, like I didn't know I had this problem. Or like, oh my God, I didn't know XYZ, right? And you want to feel them to feel that way. Because if they don't feel that way, what tends to happen here is that when you try to close the sale and they tell you it's a budget problem, they'll tell you that they don't do it now. And then when you bring up the problem and say that, hey, but you just now you're saying that you want to make sure you invest, you want to make sure they are protected and everything else, like that's why you want to do it, right? And then the prospect will be like, yeah, I understand. I totally understand the product. I totally understand the problem, but I just want to think about it and not do it now, right? And so it might even if you have done a cash flow planning for them and they have, let's say, $5,000 a month in surplus and you're proposing only a 2K a month kind of like plan, they'll still tell you they'll think about it and they might not want to do it now. Literally, right? And this is where like a lot of advisors scratch their head after that because they're like, okay, logically everything makes sense, but the prospects still don't want to do it. The prospects still do not want to, go ahead with this. And it's kind of like a big question mark, right? And the reason for that is because they might know the problem, they might understand the problem, but they might not realize it. Okay, and the way to help someone realize a problem is to ask the right questions to allow them to admit that they actually have this problem, right? And so that's really kind of like the most important thing. You need the answers out from their own mouth, because if you don't and it's only from your mouth, they can understand but they might not agree or realize it with you. Okay, and so that's basically the fifth element you want to do, which is fourth element, right, which is problem. Now, the reason why I bring up pain also, which is basically the fifth element, right, it's this. A lot of times, helping someone, even after you help someone to realize a problem, is not necessarily enough. And the reason for that is because even if they realize it, perhaps, even if they realize it, it's still relatively logical, right? It's like a logical problem to them. Like it makes sense, logically. But it might not be enough for them to take action. And that's where we need to talk about creating pain, right? Or what we call, like in sales gurus, they'll say like pain points, right? So to speak. And so we're going to talk about pain. And the reason why we need to talk about pain or bring out about pain, right, is very simple. There are basically two types of driving forces that drive human behavior. Number one is either desire, or number two is pain. And make a guess. Which one would drive human behaviors or make people take action better? Of course, pain, right? And so the whole point is that you want to inflict pain or you want to create pain. Now, obviously, I'm not saying you try to physically hurt this person, but you want to ask questions that make them realize that the problem is painful. Because think about it, right? Why do you think people, there's a golden saying when it comes to sales. People buy based on what? People buy based on emotions, and then they justify by logic, right? They buy based on emotions and justify by logic. And so, which is the reason why. So I read it here, right? People buy based on emotion, and then they justify by logic. Okay, justify by logic. And so the emotion part is basically the pain that you're inflicting or creating. And then the logical part, right, is the logical numbers, right, that you propose at the beginning, or like telling them that they have this real problem and there are certain numbers that you can put tag to it, right? And so it needs to be logical. So the key thing is this, right? Like you need to have both emotions and logic. So a lot of times when I've seen a lot of advisors, they do a lot of financial planning. And so the problem with that, right, and they still don't get a sale. And the problem with that is because a lot of the plannings, right, are logical in nature. The plannings are logical in nature. But it might not be emotional. Because you think about numbers. Numbers are boring, right? It's logical, it's plain, it's lame. And there's no, and you need to create emotions tied to these numbers, because if don't, they're not gonna basically move ahead. Okay, and of course, once they buy based on emotion, then they'll justify by logic. You need to make sure that there's a basis for the sale, right? Which is like I mentioned, the planning, the proposal, the numbers, and so forth. Okay, and so that's why you want to make sure that you inflict pain. Okay, this is like super important. I'm saying that, like, when I look through the case studies, I've done like probably more than 1,000 case studies at this point in time with different advisors, countries, from Brunei, Malaysia, Hong Kong, so on and so forth. a lot of times is they miss out problem and pain. Right? They miss out problem and pain. They go for a sales appointment just like a general pitch, right? Just like ask for some questions, tell them about their gaps, and then like pitch them the solution. Okay, and that's kind of like the issue here, right? Because if you don't talk about the problem and pain, then people are not really gonna buy a solution, or rather your solution. And there's a saying that I love to say, which is if you can't identify the problem and the pain is not painful enough, then your solution, when you pitch it, becomes a good to have rather than a must have. It becomes a good to have rather than a must have. Okay, and you definitely be sure that every time you want to make sure that your solution is a must have. And the way to make it feel like a must have is by making sure that the problem is big enough and there's huge enough of pain. Okay, and so like I dare say that 90% of the time is because like the pain and the problem isn't there. And even when objections happen, usually I don't like to talk too much about objection handling, because objections are kind of like the symptom, and the 7 elements, right, are the root cause. And so what tends to happen here is that when you try to handle objections, which is a symptom, what you're really trying to do is to try to find out the root cause. Because when someone tells you that, say that, oh, let me think about it, I need to speak to my spouse, or I think the liquidity is not there, right? For example, it usually got to do with one of these elements are not present or wasn't as strong enough during a sales appointment, right? And like I mentioned, 80-90% of the time is usually the problem and pain that's missing, or it's not created strongly, like I mentioned. Okay, and so that's basically for the first 5 elements. Now, once you do these 5 elements, then the 6 and 7 is the easy one, right? I can tell you the hard part. Like here's the thing, the first 3 are the simple things. Your last 2 are the easy ones, right? And the hardest is definitely your problem and pain. Okay, so let's talk about, like, we already get through the hardest part already. So let's talk about what's D and what's S. And so D basically stands for desire. Okay, D stands for desire. Okay, now why do we need to talk about desire? So you might be thinking at this point in time, which is like, oh my God, Ben, it's like I built a report, I built an agenda, I did a fact find. There's the problem that's being realized and the pain is painful enough. Why the hell do you need to care about desire? Well, because even if you completed these, let's say 5 elements, your prospect might not actually have a real desire to solve it at this point in time. Now, while there's pain, then they're motivated to solve this problem. They might not want to solve it now because there could be a bigger problem or pain that is more important right now. So I'll give you an example. Let's say this person is a naked prospect, right? So no hospital plan, no life plan, no term plan, no investments whatsoever. Totally clean slate. And literally just going through a divorce. Okay, literally going through a divorce right now. Now, you might have done all the pain and problem and everything else, right? This person realized, oh, I really need insurance whatsoever. But this person is also going through a divorce and a ton of legality and financial things that need to settle. So the only thing is here is that the pain over here in the other areas of his or her life is more painful than the current ones, right? It's more painful than the current ones, right? And so that's why, like, you start to realize that even though you can do everything correct, people just might not have the desire. And here's the thing, a lot of advisors, we assume that the prospect have a desire to solve it. Not true. You want to make sure that you want to test the desire, right? It's very important to test the desire. Okay, and so maybe I give an analogy. So you think about it, right? Let's say imagine your house is on fire right now, right? And then maybe you got a deep cut on your arm, but your 4-year-old son and your 5-year-old daughter is screaming for help in the next room, and they're stuck, right? Now at this point in time, would your current priority be to bandage your arm right now, or do whatever it takes to get your kids out and get out of the house, right? Hopefully your answer is the former, right? Like you probably want to get them out of the house, and while you're bleeding, and doesn't really matter as much. Okay, and so the whole point here is that you want to make sure that you check their desire, and usually a desire scale is, I have this question what I call the 1 to 10 desire, and so it sounds something like, hey, Mr. Prospect, from scale 1 to 10, how interested are you in solving and figuring these out problems, solving these problems, right? With or without me, and usually they will probably say like a 6 or 7. Now, if they say they are 10, that's great, but usually they will say they are 6 or 7. Now, here's the thing, right? If let's say they say they are 7, and then it's out of 10, right? Then the next question you want to ask is, what's the missing 3? Right? And let's say, oh, I'm a 7 out of 10. And I'm like, okay, great. So what makes up the other 3 out of 10? Right? or what will make it a 10 out of 10. And then they'll tell you certain things, right? They'll tell you that it's a concern, this is concern, whatever. And here's the beautiful part. These things that's being brought up that will make it a 10 out of 10, these are, generally speaking, the objections that they are giving you upfront. In fact, these are the genuine objections or concerns that they have, right? And so you actually want to solve these objections before even going into the next S, which is 7 element, before going to the solution, right? You want to handle these objections before providing the solution. Because if you handle the objections or you try to dig out objections after pitching them a solution, either you get a smoke screen objection, or number two, they are not even gonna tell you about the real objections and even discuss with you. Because what the prospect usually feel is that if they're trying to if their objections are being handled at the end of the call or end of the session, they will tend to feel like, oh shit, whatever answers I'm going to give you, you're going to use it against me, and therefore I feel that I don't tell you, right? Or they just give you some smoke screen. And so it's always best to dig out the objections and solve them up front before you provide a solution. This is one of the most important things, right? And so you rather solve it at the beginning before solving it at the end. Okay, and so and honestly, because at this point in time you haven't provided a solution, they are way more open, right? There's less threat in their heads. They don't perceive it to be much of a risk by telling you what they truly feel. Okay, and this way you handle their objections obviously in a nice manner, which I might cover in the next video. Okay, and so then obviously the last one then is the solution. Okay, so when it comes to solutions, I'm not going to dive deep into this video, but when you come to pitch a solution, I guess that's where most advisors really know how to do it. But there's generally a framework for it, right? So when you want to pitch a solution, you want to talk about features, benefits, right? These two are the common ones. And then the last one, right, is meaning. And if you don't talk, meaning is one of the most important things that you want to do, right? Like I mentioned, I'm not going to cover too much in this video, but basically, meaning is basically attaching a significant problem or attaching some form of significant emotions, right, to the solution, and so again, I think I wouldn't want to go in this video because I think I'll cover this video take too long. But generally speaking, then this is where you probably know how to do it, right? I mean, most advisors that I've known, they kind of like pitch a solution. And to be honest though, once you integrate the first 5 to 6 elements, the solution is really the easy part. Like I mentioned, the hardest part is the problem and pain. Okay, and so that's basically it. Okay, and so hopefully, you get this clearer right now in your sales process, that every time you go for appointment, you gotta make sure that these 7 elements that must be included, okay, in your sales appointment. Because if you don't, it's just going to be painful, right? If you look back to your case studies right now or the past cases that you have closed or have not closed, you're probably missing one of these 7 elements, right? And what tends to happen is usually the problem and pain. Okay, usually a problem and pain. Okay, so hopefully this is helpful for you. These are basically 7 elements I mentioned that every single sales appointment needs to have before you can actually really close the sale and put a prospect into buying state to say yes and also thank you even further, right? And I hope this framework is helpful because it generated our clients $125 million in sales overall, over 300 plus advisors. It's been helping them right now. And every time they go for appointment, they've been telling me that their appointments are much more predictable, it's much more consistent, and they know they feel certain, right, and confident going to appointments because now they know that every single thing that they say or every single question that they ask leads to the sale moving forward. Okay, so again, hope this video is helpful for you so that in the next sales appointment, you know exactly what you need to do, right, and rewatch it if you need to. If not, I'll see you in the next video.